There we go. Everybody should be able to hear us, should be able to be connected here. And it's recorded if you ever want to come back and refer to this. So thank you again for having me. As Tim did mention, I was a former vice president of the society, but I'm also the third-year American Orchid Society student judge. And one of the things that's been expressed was an interest in having students present their research. If you're not familiar with it, part of the AOS training, we have to do periodic presentations on different subjects in orchids. And my most recent one is on Brazilian Bifoliate Cattleyas. In large part because I'm not incredibly well versed in Cattleyas. You don't have to be an expert in everything, but also because I tend to love patterns a lot. And as you'll see from a lot of the pictures and some of the bifoliates that are actually here on display, they have a lot of interesting patterns to them. So this presentation is a result of that year-long research in the subject. So if you're not familiar, typically when we divide Cattleyas, we break them up between unifoliate, or the labiata group, and bifoliate group, which interestingly enough is actually has divided Cattleyas since they were first described by Lotiges in the Collecta Botanica in 1821. Cattleya labiata was grown by William Catley and was used as the type specimen for the genus. But also in that same publication, Lindley recognized that there was a previous description of Epidendrum violacea described by Lotiges and Sons in the Botanical Cabinet in 1819, and that was also fitting into this new genus. Another side note would be that also in that same publication, Cattleya forbesii was also described as a plant that was donated to the Horticultural Society of Rio de Janeiro by Mr. Forbes. Just noticed, we should adjust the light here. Is that better?
Yes.
So to further highlight those differences, typically the major difference between these groups is that unifoliates, one, have larger flowers with broader segments, versus bifoliates, which typically have narrow sepals and petals on a smaller flower, but those flowers have much thicker substance to them. Unifoliates also typically have a broader, we call it a clavate or a club-shaped pseudobulb, as you can see up here, versus bifoliates would have narrower, more spindle pseudobulbs to them. But you'll see actually that this is not a hard and fast rule, and a lot of the rules I'm going to present on, actually I'm going to contradict myself partway through the presentation. So just stick with me as we go through this. The important thing though is that Brazilian bifoliates are typically a little more floriferous, and they possess interesting colors and patterns, which is what drew me to this topic to begin with, despite the fact that I also find more spindly, long flowers and plants harder to grow and not as interesting to me. But one of the commonalities between all Cattleyas is that they should all possess 4 pollinia. That can be seen from a picture of the pollen for Epidendrum in the upper left, where you can see the 4 pollinia packets, versus the 8 that are typically found in things like Laelias, Schomburgkia, and Brassivola. As well as Cattleyas should have a free-hanging lip. And that's a difference between the adnate lip, or the column being attached to the lip, that's found more commonly in Epidendrums of the group. So now the real question is, what makes up Brazilian bifoliates? This might seem straightforward, especially given that there's actually an AOS handbook on Brazilian bifoliates that you can refer to. But since that webpage was created, there are 2 new species that have been described, and there's a significant amount of rearrangement of the sections and subgenera that's gone into defining these groups. So as was noted here by J.A. Fowley, and I meant to bring my book of this from 1977, it's called Brazilian Bifoliates and Their Color Varieties. It's probably the largest resource for actually defining this group. He states, and as we begin to talk about this, that it's a little hard to understand and define this group, other than the fact that they have 4 pollinia, they have showy flowers, and they come from Brazil. So I hope that you kind of understand some of the headache I went through with trying to research this topic. But don't fret, because what I hopefully will have shown you today is that I'm going to try and bring some order to this, by showing you some wonderful flowers, but also referring to some of the handouts that I've created for this talk and for you guys to refer to as you continue to look at this group. But before we get into that, I wanted to give a moment to speculate on how these unique Cattleyas species may have actually come into being. So again, referring to Jay Fowler's group from 1977, he speculates that this group of Cattleyas largely came into being following the last glacial epoch in South America, whereas you can see here, the Antarctica freeze actually developed a large Patagonian ice sheet that covered most of Chile and Argentina, which then left a whole region of freezing winters that developed far north as Rio de Janeiro. So as a result of that, you'll see that at the last glacial maxima, which can be seen on the left-hand side, most of the common ancestors for these Cattleyas were likely found in the coastal northern regions of Brazil. And then in the second image, you'll see following that glacial retreat, these Cattleyas, or these species or groups, started to make their way into these larger inland river valleys at cooler elevations. And finally, well, weird jump there. Finally, I'm seeing a different thing on my screen than you guys are seeing on yours. But finally, all these species split off and broke out into what we now would consider the separate subgroups for these species here. So quickly, what I want to do, yeah, for some reason this is jumping around a little bit for me. Typically, what I wanted to focus on is that when a lot of people think of Brazil, they think of the Amazon rainforest. And in the case of Brazilian bifoliates, that's not at all actually where you're going to find them for this work. Typically find that most of these are going to be found predominantly in this south coastal plains and mountains, shown by kind of the green color shading and elevation that you can see in the southeastern states of Minas Gerais, Espírito Santo, Rio de Janeiro, and Sao Paulo. And I mention this because, again, most people think of Amazon, but that area is far too dense and wet to really, has little air movement to really actually grow these Cattleyas well in the bright sunlight and the normal culture that they want. You will also find there's going to be a small section of these that actually reside in the coastal mountains, in the central coastal mountains and swamps of Bahia. And there's also going to be a small collection that resides in the northeastern states. But again, all coastal, all typically found in the mountainous regions. There's even a small subset that are found in the inland valleys near the federal district of Brazil. But what this means, with the risk of classifying an entire group of very diverse orchids for unique climates to have the same culture, is that most are going to be found in regions of very bright sunlight, with a few notable exceptions that we're going to talk about, but they have very high relative humidity. They get regular rain and mist from the coastal storms that break against these nearby mountains and then run back down to the ocean. That dampness from which is counteracted by regular strong winds blowing in off the ocean to dry the leaves. And so that's what I want you to consider as the growing conditions for most of the plants of this group. Again, we're going to have a few notable exceptions, and we'll talk about that as we go through. But I want you to reprioritize from the Amazon River to this more southern, eastern coastal region. And that kind of looks like some of these conditions you see here. So, what are those species that we're going to talk about? Again, I've talked about there is an AOS beginner's handbook on this subject. And the way they define that is that they first classify that it has lateral lobes which are small, and then those subgroups have inflorescences that are basal or inflorescences that are terminal. And their second category would be large lateral lobes to the lips, with either the midlobe being larger, longer clawed, midlobe being small, sessile, or subsessile. Now, I'm not a taxonomist, so a lot of these conditions kind of confused me to begin with. And when I was trying to classify this, it didn't help me particularly to try and group according to this, especially when they don't list out all the species, 21 of which in this handbook. So instead, I also looked at Jay Fowley's book, and he uses a combination of sections of the different plants, the suitable characteristics, that lip shape, and he defines a few different sections for these Brazilian bifoliates. But instead of, again, using these convoluted definitions, I'm going to define what I believe is a much more straightforward classification to help you remember these groups, again, referring to your handouts, so that you can kind of keep track of this as we go along. So if we take the sections and subsection classification from Fowley's work, by the way, I notoriously are quite politely took all of these images from his original book, his artist drawings. So I get full credit to that as we go along. But in his work, he classifies a section of Lelioides. He classifies the sections of Gymnochaila, or naked-lipped, due to the incomplete covering of the columns of these flowers. He then classifies the section of Cryptochaila, or cavern-lipped, due to the side lobes not covering the entire column. And then in that, he has subsections of granulosa, guttata, and intermedia. But what I actually did is I instead classified these based off of J. Fowl's Internet Orchid Species Photo Encyclopedia. Now, I did not research the subgenera that he assigns to those, but if I take that section and essentially reprioritize these, you'll see that Lelioides continues to be a subgenus, but instead of using Gymnochaila, or that cavern lip group, we instead break that into subgenera of Rhizantha, Aclandia, and Schomburgiana up in the top there. And now those subsections from Cryptochaila become their own subgenera, Intermedia, Granulosa, and Guttata. And so that's really what I've done to try and accommodate these more novel or modern classifications. And what this does allow us to do is fit in the two new species that have been described since J. Fowley's book of Caryi and Tenuis into their own categories. And then when you start comparing the lip shape, this allows us to better understand the significant differences between the flowers of each group. So to me, this was a bright idea. It helped me drastically to better interpret and understand the differences between these different flowers. But what also this does is then we see the differences that these genera instead accommodate the plant habit growth also from J. Fowley's book. So today, what I'm going to talk you through is my understanding of Brazilian bifoliate Cattleyas by grouping amongst these 7 subgenera. And just to note, we started a little late, but there are 21 species and another 7 natural hybrids. So we're going to kind of move along here as we go through. So feel free to ask questions, but expect that we'll have a fast pace. So what better way to start with the interesting conundrum of Cattleya dormeniana. This is the only Cattleya in the Lelioides subgenera. And while it does have nice large side lobes, as you can see on it, where the lip actually gets encapsulated by the column, and it does have a nice showy midlobe, as well as it kind of falls in this intermediate range of height between all of these bifoliate Cattleyas, with about a 7-inch tall pseudobulb. That doesn't include leaves, just the pseudobulb. The most notable characteristic about this species is that it actually has an additional 4 rudimentary pollinia along with the standard 4 that we get from Cattleya. So what they actually believe causes a lot of people to speculate is that this species actually might mark an evolutionary transition between Laelia and Cattleya. Now, I will note that most of the cultivated specimens of Cattleya dormeniana today are noted to only have 4 pollinia native to them. So if you go in there and start counting, I'm not wrong on that. What they've found is that the ones that they tend to have in cultivation right now have completed that transition from Laelia to the Cattleya genera. Now, its range is in the Organ Mountains. Like I said, it's in the state of Rio de Janeiro. It is extremely humid and moist on the ridge where this is found. And so what actually happens is that dormeniana is known to grow saprophytically. Sorry, it's a cumbersome word there. But what that means is that it lives and feeds on dead and decaying plant matter in the trunks of a very particular species of dogbane, about 2,000 feet in elevation, below steep cliffs of exposed granite. So because this species grows in one of the highest rainfall regions of Brazil, it has very high humidity, and the trees in the region rapidly decompose, which is why it grows this saprophytically. Because it grows in this very unique growth environment, it's been limited in cultivation. It can be purchased, but I want to note that this particular species should be treated with care. So it does also have an even more rare and hard to find semi-alba varietal with some striking green petals, as you can see here, but good luck finding that. Instead, you might actually be interested in trying to grow a hybrid of this difficult to grow species with Cattleyas bicolor, as you can see in the bottom right there. This is another bifoliate that we're going to talk about in just a moment. But this hybrid makes true for its cat. And as you can see here, it has nice stark, dark petals and sepals with that still bright, now larger lip that can be found in Dormeniana. Yeah.
When you say it comes from the area of the highest rainfall in Brazil, do you know how many inches a year they get? I mean, are we talking 80 inches a year, or?
It's going to be close to that. I knew it off the top of my head, and I meant to put it in here and actually bring that up, but it is very high.
Oh, wow.
And it's because, like I talked about, most people think of the Amazon River. It is high rainfall there too. But what you have is those now coastal storms coming up. They hit these not super high mountains, not as tall as the Andes in Peru, but they are pretty high mountains off the coast. And all of that rainwater falls right back down into the ocean and right into the swamps where this can be found, and where most of these are going to be found. Okay. Moving on from Dormeniana, we're going to start talking about the hybrid that the next group falls into, bicolor, in the subgenus Schomburgkiana. Now, most of these plants, as you can see here on the right, grow well over 2-foot tall pseudobulbs, which, as you might be familiar with, the synonymous genus of Schomburgkiana is going to in no way surprise you, because those are really tall plants in and of themselves. But this group can be classified again on the similarities in the lip, with the exception of bicolor, which has very, very small side lobes. What you can see here is that typically most of these are going to have a very ruffled, bifurcated midlobe, and you tend to see that all throughout the different species in this group. So with bicolor, this is an outlier again because of the near loss of the side lobes. I'm not joking you here. This is actually the column. This is not the side lobes of the lip that are coming up. It has a very distinctive large column. But this group is actually probably this species is the most diverse amongst the bifoliates in and of themselves, with some people speculating that it actually has 3 subspecies of its own. So in the future, this actually might get split out into different regions. The first of which would be the coastal subgenus of Minas Gerais. It's often found to have the best overall form, which is essentially what I'm showing you here, where you have good, nice shaped sections, nice shaped segments, but this contains a smaller lip in this particular subgenus. The converse of that would be the inland high mountains, and this subspecies of brasiliensis has smaller segments overall, but a much better lip on it. This flower also does have a semi-alba and an alba, as well as cerulean forms, and one thing you'll see is that there also is variable amounts of spotting that can be found within each of these groups. So this amount of high variability and the climate from which bicolor has been grown has resulted in roughly 42 AOS awards for it, but it's been used in over 335 hybrids of the bifoliate group. So that makes this a slightly easier candidate for actually growing in cultivation if you are interested in this particular flower. In comparison, also in this group, you'll find one of the tallest inflorescences of the entire group, Cattleyas elongata. That's what it's named for the sheer height of the flower spike that it produces on here. If you can see from J. Fowles' Crowley's rendering of it, he doesn't even draw the spike attached to the plant because it is so tall. This spike itself can reach over 3 feet on its own. So this species carries the iconic skinny kind of ruffled petals similar to Schomburgkia orchids, but it does actually have a pretty limited usefulness in breeding, which is a shame because the species grows in a variety of regions and does show a large amount of adaptability. It's noted particularly for its growth in totally exposed conditions. So the winds in this area can often contort the developing inflorescences as they're actually putting up those really tall inflorescences. And much like Bifoliate Cattleyas, it grows in full rock. It is within deep depressions filled with organic matter, but much to the chagrin of many growers, it distincts a very large dry season for approximately half the year, the other half being incredibly wet. So that might be part of the cultivation issues that people have with actually growing this particular species on their own. It does, however, an albiform, but neither of these has been much used because of that unruliness of the plant. Grown in the same region and at lower elevations is Cattleyas tenuis. This ruffled leaf group instead prefers to grow on trees, but it will also reach over 3 feet in height. So as such, it's noted to dislike to be growing in pots, and it would be recommended to cultivate this by mounting a 3-foot Cattleya. Good luck with that. While there are no listed cultivars of tenuis, because this is actually the most recently described species of the group from 1983, it does have semi-albiforms that begin to show up. And perhaps our first direct contradiction would be moving on to Violacea, in which I did talk about that we are talking about Brazilian bifoliates at the start. Cattleyas violacea, while it can be found in the tributaries of its primary range, it's largely not a Brazilian orchid. It's a Venezuelan. So I'm going to briefly return back to the elevation map that we looked at before to show you where Violacea sits on the border between Venezuela in the north and Brazil located there. This area is a much more humid, year-round mountainous range. It's on the equator. So this species does not like cold weather. Doesn't really like to be below 80 degrees Fahrenheit and should be kept warm throughout its growth. Now there are speculations as to how Cattleyas made it all the way up past the Amazon to this northern range. I don't know for sure, but I have been told that the Amazon River used to empty into the Pacific, and after the Andean Mountains rose up, it redirected to flow outwards to the Atlantic Ocean, and that likely could have been the precipitous effect that actually resulted in the splitting off of this Cattleya. Now, I'm not a geologist. I don't know timetable-wise if that actually matches up with the speciation of these Cattleyas, but that could be one of the deciding factors for why Violacea ended up on the other side of this mountainous range. This orchid is known to be a very fragrant orchid. I can personally actually attest to that because I hosted Eric Madsen's awarded plant after the Springfield show at my home, and it was wonderful to have inside. They are quite compact for this particular group, as we talked about. Most of them are really tall, with pseudobulbs only about 8 to 10 inches tall. That doesn't include, again, the leaves and the inflorescence. And there are a number of color varieties available should you wish to try to grow this in the warm, humid conditions that it's necessary for. I've never grown it, but if you're interested, you could talk to Eric about how he actually grows it. So conversely, for size and vigor, you might consider obtaining a hybrid of this wonderful species, such as Brudiana, which is a hybrid of Lodogicei, again, the type species for the bifoliates, as well as Violacea. And I think it also has quite a beautiful color variety and good variation that you get with Violacea, as you can typically see from these other color forms on the right here. So from that, I'm going to lead us into the intermediate group, which is where Lodogicei is found. Again, this is known for its cavern lip due to the large side lobes. And only in this case does it have a very moderate mid-lobe. But it does have nice, thin, ruffled edge to most of them, as you'll see from the flowers above. Perhaps not surprisingly, they possess an intermediate height, which is what intermediate is named for, of the Brazilian bifoliates, only being about 12 to 16 inches in suitable height. So the exception of this would be Cattleya forbesii, which is, again, one of the first two that was described, and it's actually the smallest of the group. So I'm going to start off by describing this. It's only about 8 inches tall. Well, not diminutive in any way. It grows in warm swamps just off the coast. So what that looks like is just past these sand dunes that you would typically find right off of the Rio de Janeiro coast, you see these areas where it actually begins to trap water on the opposite side of them. And again, that's because that water coming off the mountains gets stuck there, and the group tends to prefer these swampy areas just off the coast, similar to something like Cattleya harrisoniana, which is also part of this group. That can be seen here, where it actually grows in the crevices of trees, where plant matter and debris and water actually collect to service this fairly open, sunlit region of the swamps. So harrisoniana, again, can be seen here, is also a very pretty pink flower, but it does have other color forms on it. And of these intermediate group, the first two I described here are less cultivated, less commonly available. We now get into intermedia, which grows in the same region, maybe a little closer to the coast, but is much more preferred by most growers. It will note that sometimes intermedia can actually be so blown by wind as it's getting dried out during its cultivation that it actually can get covered by the sand in those sand dunes that are there. But it actually will tend to grow in thickets underneath that, as you can see here, where you have nice hot sun baking these Cattleyas, and you can see other tropical plants such as bromeliads tend to grow right around them. So it's noted that intermedia is essentially a weed in this environment. From here you can kind of see, because it's covered by sand, why that intermediate height might actually help it. But also, again, that coastal breeze and regular watering are important. And they help balance these long, thin Cattleyas, which don't have very large pseudobulbs, to stay hydrated while growing in this hot sun. So what I like to think of, and I'm not absolutely sure this is true because I've never been to Rio de Janeiro, but I've been to Waikiki Beach, and that's kind of what I would think of, where you're getting that coastal wind. It's still pretty humid, but you do have regular sun that's shining on you. So that's the environment that I'm sort of picturing for intermedia. Intermedia does have some great color forms, such as the Aquini here, which has a little bit broader petal stance and a larger lip for the intermedia group. And intermedia has one of the highest number of AOS awards, with 210 awarded, and it also has no less than 186 hybrids. So this is by far preferred of this group, and you can actually see that of why this is as preferred. I will note that the Aquini hybrid over here is artificially propagated. It does not occur in the natural habitat, but you tend to find these quite often now if you're searching for them. Intermedia also has an albiform and a ceruleiform. And finally, we'll list off the last of this group, which is the type specimen for bifoliates, which is Cattleya lodogicei. This species can be found in the first mountain range off those hills and coastal southeast region. It's the highest growing of the bifoliates, and it actually can handle a decent amount of frost. So lodogicei has been awarded no less than 115 times, and it's been used in no less than 310 hybrids. So similar to intermedia, this is well preferred of the group. And the last of it would be Carrii, which is the most recently described in the intermediate bifoliates. It's actually quite small for the group, with only about 12 inches tall. And it's found in the northern state of Bahia. It's great looking pink species, similar to harrisoniana, but it contains only a single leaf on its pseudobulb of the bifoliates.
Single leaf.
Yeah, single leaf. So much for bifoliates here. I told you we're going to be full of contradictions as we go through. So this has only recently begun receiving awards and has been used in hybridization, probably because of its rarity. I will note that if you're familiar with Marnie Turkle, who does flasking, she does have a flask of carrier that's available. I wanted to purchase it and bring some seedlings in for people to share at this meeting, but they weren't readily available. So if anybody's interested in possibly wanting to grow some of this, let me know. So from here, we're going to switch to the next group of larger bifoliates in the subgenus Granulosa. So these plants are marked by the rather distinctive isthmus between the side lobes and the midlobe. And this typically flares at the end, but as you can probably understand by the name, there's a lot of granulations on that midlobe of the limb. That's where granulosae comes into play. Now again, fairly tall among Brazilian bifoliates. We're taking a step up from the intermediate group. They all possess a very distinctive bent or kind of falcate structure to their petals and their lateral sepals. And some have slightly broader segments of their widths. They have a rather distinctive long granular lip, which is again what Granulosa is named for. So I've been told that this is a very fragrant species, Granulosa. It's grown on the northeastern coast of Brazil in kind of the equatorial climates. And it's the only real species of note within this Granulosa group. So I'll talk about the other two, but I'm going to spend more time on these. Because while it's only received 42 AOS awards, it has a decent amount of 85 hybrids compared to the 14 and 2 hybrids from Schofeldiana and a single award for Porphyrosa. So Granulosa, if you like that long, elongated midlobe, is probably going to be what you favor for. Granulosa grows in sand dunes. Again, it grows in vegetation very close to the beach, only about a quarter-mile off of it. Again, under very exposed conditions, which means a lot of sun that's hitting this. It does have several variable color forms, from that standard yellow-green to this much darker color form, and even those without spotting or with even more spotting. It has been noted to also have this really striking red color form, which is only obtained by growing under very intense lights. Reviewing this work, Francisco Miranda actually does tours of this area, and he does a presentation I'll talk about at the end. He notes that the very, very strong color form that you can find in nature of red, he's never even been able to see it achieved under artificial lights in a greenhouse or anywhere. That's how much light these actually get in their native environment. So in comparison, Schofeldiana, again, similarly tall. A lot of these are noted to have very delicate growths, usually mean, again, that more water is needed. There's less storage capability within these tall, spindly growths. And it's grown a little bit further south of Bahia. But since it's only been awarded 14 times and has only been used twice in hybridization, it's likely a sign that it's fairly rare in cultivation. But it does also, the reason that this has likely been less awarded, it possesses a fair amount of pinching on these internodes between segments, which kind of reduces the overall fullness of the flower. As you can probably see here on the right, this image is just a reference, but it goes to show that not all judges are correct. There's probably no reason that this should have received an AOS award in its form, especially with the way those segments are contorted and irregular. And it's an AM too. So. But that's probably truly what Schofeldiana tends to do a lot, which is why you probably find your favorite Granulosa in cultivation. But nonetheless, the green form can be quite pretty. It also has this darker filled in color form and has more of a yellowish color form that's also available. So the last of this group, which is significantly rarer to find, with only one AOS award, which is a CBR, and if you're not familiar with that system, we typically give that to the very first plant that we see at the judging table, meaning this has probably only really been seen once, or it doesn't favor a very good form to actually merit AOS awarding. So The only picture I found for it is what you see here. This is found much further south in Sao Paulo, but I want to note that this is named for the very distinctive porphyrins that are found in hemoglobin in your blood, which actually gives it this very distinct coloration on its lip. So also, it can be found with kind of a greener yellow color form, while still maintaining that very dark colored lip because of those porphyrins that are present. But with that, let's move on to a better group, a similarly ridge-lipped color group of Gutata. What this one you'll see there's a much less distinctive isthmus in it, but with that you're getting a rounder, larger midlobe. And this group is moderately sized with some notable distinctions. Again, full of contradictions, but we'll talk about them. So the first of this group would be the namesake, Cattleyas gutata. This is a very fragrant orchid, but it is known for very tall flower spikes. Because of that, it can actually have up to 50 flowers on a single spike. So no wonder it's been used in over 200 hybrids. But this also stands out as the tallest Brazilian bifoliate, ranging from a respectable 7 to 10 inches to well over 5 feet.
Oh.
So this is no small orchid if you are going to get into it. Beware that these grow quite large. Now I don't know if in cultivation they grow up to 5 feet, but in their natural habitat they are well known for being extremely tall plants. This plant in and of itself, while not being tall, is over 4 feet wide. It also grows in this swampy coastal region and can often be surrounded by other plants, even cacti. So that's how well draining the soil can be, but again, regular rain keeps these alive. So gutata does have some interesting color forms, from the cerulea you see here on the left to semi-alba on the right, alba, and even heavily spotted. But in my opinion, it holds nothing to its sister species of Cattleyas tigrina. Note that this is commonly sold under another descriptor name, Leopoldii. Tigrina gets precedence and is the true name for it, but the Leopoldii is a very, very common synonym used for this orchid species. I've been told this is the most fragrant orchid of the bifoliates.
What causes the shininess on the petals? I don't think I've ever seen that.
So I don't know for sure that this is true, but in my opinion, its strong waxy behavior comes from the sheer amount of sun that these orchids receive. And typically that darkening of the petals that you see in a lot of these happens as essentially a sunscreen, a protective from the sheer amount of sun. Huh?
It's a cuticle, like a...
Yeah. And most of these are, again, bifoliates are known for their substance, but also this waxy sort of structure and behavior to their sepals and petals. So that's a really common amongst all of them. But again, the most fragrant species of this entire group. So if you're looking for fragrance, choose this one. It's a respectable 2 foot tall in good culture. Yeah.
What does it smell like?
I have no idea, actually. I'll go from what I thought Violacea smelled like, which is just a general, really strong floral smell. Not too citrusy, just a very pleasant odor, but I've never actually seen one in person to know how fragrant it is. This information comes from, again, Francisco Miranda, which is Brazilian. He actually grows in Florida now, and he does a lot of tours of the area, so a lot of my culture tips came from him, and he's probably the expert I would go to find that out. So tigrina also comes in a lot of different color forms. Again, you can see semi-alba on the left-hand side. You have full alba on the right. There's cerulea and whatever this is, lilacina. But there's also peloric versions. Again, these have all been bred in captivity. These are not natural, found in their wild range, but they are very interesting if you're looking for, again, a very fragrant, interesting orchid to work with, but not small. So similar vein, but a lot shorter, only about less than a foot tall, would be Schilleriana. And this particular grows in the mountains. It does prefer a slightly drier period and lower elevations, which makes people say that it can be harder to cultivate because it's adapted to very specific growing regions. But in my opinion, the 186 AOS awards and the 122 hybrids would beg to differ that this is incredibly hard to cultivate because a lot of people obviously have it and prefer to grow it. This, again, has very big, ruffled flowers. You have this nice, large, flared lip. So in my opinion, it's a great way to get that smaller bifoliate with plenty of color. However, probably the most unique among this ridge lip group would be Amethystoglossa. We actually had one of these in our show in January. These plants can be taller, again, about 2 feet, but they can carry up to 20 flowers on their very large inflorescences. And I've been told they're easy to grow as well as being fragrant. So you can see here what a typical inflorescence looks like, this nice globe-like structure with Amethystoglossa flowers growing all around it. It's received a respectable 92 AOS awards, but it's only been used in 58 hybrids. So I don't have a reason for that, but I think it's very impressive showing. So to keep this moving along, we're going to head towards the end of some smaller plants, if that's more of your thing for bifoliates. And both of these next two are actually going to be possessing what we call a panderiform or a fiddle-shaped lip structure. Cattleya clandiae we'll start with. It has similar wide cleft midlobes. It's a little less granular than the other group of Amethystoglossa and Schilleriana, but again has now some smaller side lobes that don't completely cover the column. That's very distinctive of a clandiae. There, I think, was a hybrid out here that you can actually look at if you want to see it in person. This actually only stands less than 6 inches tall. So that small plant over there is going from the really tall groups that we just talked about to nice, very small plant. That doesn't include the inflorescences, but to me it's very impactful for a small plant, and it has great color and pattern. So a clandiae is known for growing in fairly coastal regions under, again, heavy rain conditions. It likes to be grown warm, moist conditions. Again, think of growing it in Hawaii. If you're able to achieve that, I've been told it can actually grow year-round. So it has no rest period. However, again, Francisco Miranda notes that this species produces very few roots, and so you should be careful not to damage the roots if you're repotting it. He recommends just taking it and putting it in a whole new pot, not disturbing the roots at all. There are several color forms of a clandiae. Again, we have this dark nigrescence version, we have an albescence version, we have cerulean, we have alba, and it's, in my opinion, one of the quaintest and best grown in this group. Its sister species in the Clandiae group would be Cattleya velutina. This is actually a much larger plant. It's more floriferous, however, like Amethystoglossa, but it can be a finickier species to grow. It's only received 11 AOS awards. It only has 8 hybrids, probably because, again, it doesn't like to get below 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So keep that in mind if you're growing this plant. It's not something to be grown outside. Velutina looks like this. As you can see, again, similar to Amethystoglossa, produces this nice bowl-covered inflorescence. And it actually has this darker color form, as you can see on the right, but also this yellow color form, which is noted particularly around the lip, which is fairly rare to find if you're looking for it. And finally, our last section of species would be the smallest of all the bifoliates, but definitely not the least. This would be the subgenus Rhizantha. Again, similar panderiform or fiddle-shaped lip structure, but in this case, all of these bloom from basal inflorescences. And that's really where this stands out. A note on those inflorescences, they're actually modified pseudobulbs. Usually they're leafless, This is actually grown in Mobot, so this was flowering today. I took a photo of it, Cattleyas walkeriana. And on the right side, you can see where it previously was putting off a new suitable. That's what turned into this flower. So instead of producing an inflorescence, that modified suitable turns into the flower itself. And I'll note that this one actually does have a leaf on it and a dead flower, so it's not a hard and fast rule that they're always leafless. But in this case, that's what the Rhizantha group is known for, is these modified pseudobulbs that actually put off the inflorescences. And I've been told they'll actually grow all throughout the season. First, we're going to start with Cattleyas nobilior. Again, this is the larger of the pseudobulb-wise plants of the two species. This species grows in the coastal wet regions, in the interior portion of Brazil, and therefore it actually does prefer a very distinctive dry season. So this is the one group that I will say is not your standard wet, high mountainous coastal range. This actually is going to be in that dry region where it was browner on the image we saw. That's where these tend to favor. So nobilior produces flowers at the end of its dry season. I believe that's around 8 to 10 months. Walkeriana produces it at the beginning, but it has a shorter dry season of only 5 months. So nobilior is the smaller flowered of these species, but in my impression, it's nonetheless impressive. It does have different color forms, from Salme alba or Amalie to a much darker color form. However, it's hard to hold a candle to its much more celebrated sister species of Cattleyas walkeriana. This is a miniature Cattleya species, and this plant is bursting with color in its very large, round, flat flowers. So add in the fragrance to that, and it's easy to understand why this has received 164 AOS awards and been used in no less than 400 hybrids. So if you're going to know any bifoliate, this is probably the one that you know. It's a smaller species, so it's understandable. It has a lot of color varieties, from semi-alba to alba. It has cerulean to albescens. It has flame, like violacea, on this side here, and rubra on the right side there. So it's easy to see why this species has garnered so much attention of the Brazilian bifoliates. Now, I didn't have a great place to insert this category, but oftentimes as AOS judges, we get asked what we're looking for when we're judging Cattleyas. And I thought judging walkeriana shows it perfectly. What we are looking for is a very round, flat flower, where its sepals and petals fill in, its sepals fill in the space between its petals and its lip to create that fullness. And from what we're looking for is that typically the lateral lobes are going to cover the column. In this case, walkeriana has a little bit smaller lateral lobes, not fully covering, but it's a great example. And we are looking for all those components to be in plane, as well as the lip to not stick out at a 90-degree angle. You want it flat because that helps fill in the space. So this really describes why walkeriana has been noted for the Brazilian bifoliates. It's really common to see this behavior on them. It's quite an impressive flower.
For a lot of the flowers you showed, they don't fit that judging criteria.
Yep.
So
what the sentiment would be, that's part of the reason why a lot of the bifoliates don't get the awards they should be. A good example would be the one I presented where it actually was losing all of that shape in between in the crevices. But what you will find, and especially with walkeriana, it's been line bred over and over to get more and more round, flat, full petals. And that's why what you typically will see with AOS awards is that over time they should actually increase in quality. You should be seeing more and more of them fitting this criteria, and that's what we are looking for as we're judging new stuff. So even though you might see an award in the system that looks exactly like your flower, if it's been heavily awarded, it's not likely to receive quite as high a score because in our judgment that scale is shifted over time. So that is not uncommon to Brazilian bifoliates though, and you kind of just have to appreciate them for what they are. So with these 21 species, it's near impossible to cover all hybrids. However, there are some natural hybrids that I do at least spend some time covering. Probably the most prevalent would be Cattleyas. This is a natural hybrid, again, of the type specimen Lodogicii and Walkeriana, just as we discussed. And it does begin to elongate those pseudobulbs, as you can see on the right, of Walkeriana, but it's still a much smaller plant than Lodogicii. Furthermore, while the side lobes are larger and starting to cover them, it still actually gives that nice pendiform shape, or the fiddle-shaped structure if you were to open up that lip. In a similar vein would be the natural hybrid of Schilleriana and Walkeriana. Again, Schilleriana is not an incredibly tall plant on its own, so it doesn't seem to elongate nearly as much, but it does have some interesting pattern that actually gets transferred into the mid-lobes of Walkeriana. This is XYDI, sorry. And then natural hybrids within their own groups would be things like Isabella, which is Forbesii by intermedia, again in the intermedia group. In my opinion, this is a natural combination of the two, but it's kind of hard to say if the Forbesii reduces the size, because this is really not as common in culture, and so the only limited images I could find were really what you're seeing up here. If you know somebody that has one of these plants, please let me know. It'd be interesting to pick their brain about it. And just a taste of what it looks like to hybridize with unifoliates. You have Gutata hybridizing with Labiata, again the unifoliate type specimen or Cattleyas type specimen, in the Victoria Regina. This shows decent substance. In my opinion, you're actually getting much better now crystalline patterning texture to the sepals and petals, like uncommon to the waxy nature of the bifoliates. You do spread out those nice broad petals to create something, but what you can find is that you rather quickly do lose substance in the outer edges of those petals, where they're pulling in on themselves and they tend to wilt a little bit more, and that can be a problem when hybridizing between these two groups of the unifoliate and the bifoliates. So I hope I didn't drag on too long I go too quickly through everything, but I do want to leave you with a few small notes just as a reminder of what makes up Brazilian bifoliates. They're typically tall and elongated pseudobulbs, but not always. They're bifoliate, but not always. They're from Brazil, but not always. And they're also Cattleyas, but not always. The one thing that they are is they do have good substance. They do have great color and patterning, and they are usually defined by the lip. So hopefully the handout I've created for you will help you understand how these are grouped together in order to bring some more rationality to the bifoliates. This is brand new. I've never shared it with anybody, but it really helped me understand it a lot more, so I hope that it's helped you. And then the other characteristic that this translates to then is the height, behavior, and how these tend to grow between those groups. So just a little bit on conclusions and leave you with a little bit more. I do want to recognize that I took a lot of the culture conditions from Francisco Miranda. If you are an AOS member, there is a webinar that you can actually watch to find out a little bit more about growing Brazilian bifoliates, as well as if you are interested in trying to purchase some of these from Brazil. Right now it's really hard to get plants in from out of country just because of the sheer cost of shipping and things like that. But mirandaorchids.com actually does sell within Florida, so you can buy stuff on his website online, as well as if you are interested in getting something that he doesn't have there is an order that's planned to be purchased through Steve Gonzalez in Minneapolis, through Orchid Tradicio, who is a Brazilian vendor, and I'm looking at ordering some stuff in July, so if you are interested in getting some of that stuff, they are also another vendor that you can look into. So with that, I'll leave it for questions.
You don't want to repot those unless they have actively growing new roots, and especially to try to do it as soon as you see it. Otherwise, they're going to mope around and probably die on you.
I would say that's a good rule of thumb for almost any plants that are growing, but yes, especially within this group, because they have such heavy watering, they put out fast, very quick growing roots, and that's really the time to look at replanting those. So I would say, yeah.
How was it decided that a single foliate should go with, or the bifoliate should go with the singles?
It really has to do with the evolutionary characteristics. The unifoliate nature is just something that was lost. The closest ancestor, again, not being a taxonomist, but for things like Walkeriana and the Eclandiae group, Carrii, which is in the intermediate group, are still the bifoliates themselves. So really just over time, those plants have recognized that they don't need the two leaves in order to produce as much energy, and they just recess that, so they went to a single unifoliate leaf. But that being said, if you're looking for two leaves to tell whether or not a bifoliate's in there, know that it's not always the case, especially with Walkeriana, which is used in over 400 hybrids. So.
Did they retain other characteristics that kept them with the bifoliates then, or?
I mean, things like you talked about the nice substance and texture. You can see the lip shape is very similar to it. So yeah, the closest ancestor is still all of these other bifoliates, and they developed through that, but they just have lost that extra leaf. In the case of Walkeriana and Nobilia, those Rhizantha groups, I'm not surprised because they also have gone from the long spindle shape where they don't store a lot of energy in that long pseudobulb to much more bulbous. And so they can probably withstand that, as well as the fact that they go through very distinctive rest periods for that, so they don't need always their large leaves.
A lot of this change is environmental.
You talked about the change in the leaves and their behavior. At least from my understanding, that's what people believe is, amongst all of them, the speciation has come from the different microclimates. The general rule still applies: hot, humid, and wet, good wind is what you're going to find for almost all of these. But those little microclimates, the slight changes in elevation, I didn't talk about it, but the highest mountain, like where, forgetting the name of it off the top of my head, that's frost tolerant, is around up to 9,000 feet. So they're not small, they're over a mile high. But those variations coming down to coastal levels are really those microclimates that they found them. And a lot of these, because they're grown in such a small region, are grown right next to each other. But the ones that don't hybridize is usually because they flower in a different season than their counterpart that they're growing next to. So you don't find those natural hybrids. Any other questions? Hopefully that was helpful. Feel free to check out the bifoliates that are over here to get one up close in person. Again, I don't grow any of these as of yet. I've started buying many different seedlings, but they're a long way from actually getting into flowers. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again, Ed, I appreciate it. Couple notes also. We are going to be selling plants at the Carnivorous Plant Society, which is their show is June 20th. And if somebody would like to help us